Our speaker this evening, Angela Dwyer, is originally from Nebraska, and she was raised in Texas. She moved to Colorado in 2010 and worked for Audubon Rockies on habitat restoration and at CSU on several GIS vegetation mapping projects before joining the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies in 2012. She studied water birds and received a master's degree in wildlife management at Stephen F. Austin State University in Texas in 2006, and she's been working with birds ever since. Prior to moving to Colorado, Angela was the conservation biologist for Audubon, North Carolina from 2007 to 2010, chasing shorebirds on the beach. She loves exploring Colorado through birding, hiking, and skiing. Angela, we're pleased to have you as our speaker tonight.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Sharon, Jim, and David for the invite. I'm happy to be here. And thank you all for spending your time with me this evening. For the interest of my bandwidth, I'm going to keep my video off during the presentation, and then I will pop it back on at the end for questions and discussion. All right, well, thank you all. As Bill mentioned, I've been with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies for a long time now, nearly 12 years. Before moving to Colorado, I had really honed my skills in shorebird ID, working with the National Audubon Society, where I learned all about various plovers out east. And yes, on the East Coast, I learned to say plover, not plover, and that I can't shake that. So when I moved out west, everyone said plover, and I was very confused. And then I learned it's an East-West Coast thing. I originally started when we were Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory, before we had our big name change a few years after that. And my job was working exclusively with mountain plovers and farmers in western Nebraska, which I'll go into a little bit about that. But today I'm going to focus on this rare declining species, including some innovative techniques that we've employed for more than a decade, some management techniques on farmlands, go into some research, and some things we're doing right now to conserve the species. All right. Get my slideshow going for you guys. Okay, so first I want to start with, and hopefully you're seeing my presentation view and not my notes view. Just chime in if that's different. But I do want to start with a fun little story about the guy you see here on the right, this banded plover. So this photo is taken by a former PhD student who I still work with, Allie Pierce. She's now since graduated, but she took this photo in Mexico on its wintering grounds. Notice he or she, whoever he is wearing the colors of the Mexican flag, which is quite fitting. So he was banded in the summer of 2016 by Allie on the breeding grounds where she's been working or has worked up in South Park, Colorado. So if you're unfamiliar, South Park, as the crow flies, South Park is due south of Breckenridge in high elevation plateau. Perfect breeding areas for the species. So she banded this bird in 2016, as I mentioned. It was seen in the winter of 2016 in Mexico by partners down there. It returned to South Park again in the summer of 2017, was recaptured by Allie. She had then added a GPS tag so we could learn more about its movement, migration, winter. It was then seen again in Mexico in the winter of 2017 by a student we worked with, Julio and Allie. She had gone down there for the winter to help Julio with surveys. And so she saw her own banded bird on its wintering grounds. So she took this photo of her own bird that she banded. He then returned to South Park the summer of 2019, was spotted again in the winter of 2019, but has not been seen since. So I'm sure he's still hanging around, but he has quite a legacy. And so before I get started, I just want to familiarize anyone who's not aware of our organization, but we are a nonprofit conservation organization focusing our work on conserving birds and their habitats based in Colorado. We have an office in Fort Collins and Brighton. And we also work throughout the West in a variety of ways. So we collect and analyze bird data for hundreds of species across the annual cycle. We deliver land stewardship to farmers and ranchers across 6 states, and we reach hundreds of people ranging from ages 2 to age 82 in education opportunities. So I like to think of this as the visual manifestation of our goal as an organization, which is to work toward functional, sustainable working lands that benefit land, people, and wildlife that all depend on them. Just want to highlight our partnerships. I always like to include this slide because this slide probably doesn't even cover half of the partners we work with. But when you put them all on a screen like this, it's quite impressive. And we couldn't do any of our work without our partners, our donors, our members, just anybody who cares about people, birds, or land. So first, I just want to start with a little bit about the state of our birds. In 2019, a study was published in Science showing we've lost nearly 3 billion birds since 1970. Thus, we are in an existential crisis when it comes to our birds. And this may not be news to any of you. You're probably very aware of this. If anyone would like to see the paper, I'm happy to send it to Bill to share along with the group, including the website, where there are some great resources in how people in everyday lives can make little to big changes to help birds. So what this paper also highlighted is if you drill down by bird guild, you can see on the bottom in the red box, that grassland birds are in the steepest decline at over half of all grassland birds that have been lost since 1970. I'll just briefly touch on causes of concern for our grassland birds. Habitat loss, of course, is huge, particularly related to conversion from grass to crop, from invasive trees, converting grasslands to woodlands, and human development. But there are many other factors that contribute to this. And then certainly when it comes to our grassland birds, many of them are found on private working farms and ranches. And many species actually depend on livestock grazing and management. Some of them require the habitat that only livestock grazing can create. However, many livestock grazing management plans tend to focus on what we call managing to the middle to optimize grass production in cattle operations. USDA programs that typically assist farmers and ranchers are often pretty conservative rather than adaptive, and they do this to avoid soil erosion and drought-related consequences, understandably, but this can leave our shortgrass prairie specialists out on a limb, such as the mountain plover, which really relies on habitat that is not as favorable for typical ranching operations. Okay. So now let's get to the star of the show and talk about the elusive and sometimes affectionately called the prairie ghost. So this rare bird is endemic to the Great Plains. You can see by this range map how restricted their breeding population is. And actually these blobs of breeding and wintering are probably a bit exaggerated. It's probably even more condensed than this. And much of the research that has been done for the species over the last several decades has pretty much occurred on its breeding grounds. It can be easier to study breeding birds. They're tied to a location, to a nest. And so we can learn a lot by a population by studying breeding birds. The Road to Recovery is one effort that was spearheaded from that 2019 Science paper as a means to take action. And so there's been a lot of interest and development on what we can really do to help this species. One thing that was determined, there was a prioritization effort that occurred, and the mountain plover was listed as what they call a tipping point species, or as a very high urgency. So basically, we need to act now in order to save this species. Considered a shorebird, although not found at the beach, it will forage around dry playas, prefers very little vegetation, sod fields, farm grounds, heavily grazed areas, recent burns, just not ideal for many species, but this guy loves that. And is related and certainly has very similar behavior and patterns as other plovers, if you're familiar with them. And they have that stop-go kind of motion when they're running off from an area. And then they tend to be sometimes confused with a killdeer. And there have been times when I get a call of somebody noting a mountain plover, but what really is the indicator that it's likely a killdeer is that it's found in an urban area. And so these guys are very unlikely to be easily seen, and they're going to be seen in more rural farm grounds. And when I said rare, I certainly meant it. It's estimated to be about 18 to 20,000 individuals. However, that population estimate is, I'd say, nearly, not quite, but nearly 20 years old. So it is out of date. But current estimates from the Breeding Bird Survey do put it at losing birds at a rate of 3% per year, which is cumulatively is very high. And we do know that 80% of the entire population breeds in Colorado. So Colorado remains a good stronghold for the species. They're nomadic. So if they're breeding in a site 1 year and they return the next and don't like what they see, they'll move along and find something better suited, as I mentioned. Whether it's a fallow farm field that suddenly has now tall growing corn, they'll go somewhere else. We do know that, especially the Pawnee National Grassland, they used to do prescribed burns specifically for mountain plover habitat creation. And the results are pretty efficient. And we've seen fall or spring burns that result in a nest immediately. Pair keys in on those burn scars on the landscape as they're returning from migration. And they will occupy those areas pretty easily. But they can be very site faithful. So this photo on the right is this little guy. That photo was taken in 2016. And at the time, this is a 2-year-old adult who we had banded as a 2-week-old chick. And a little bit more about this guy in a bit, but just to highlight some of the examples of that site fidelity. So what you're seeing here, this is a Google Earth map from Kimball County, Nebraska. You can see the habitat is largely dryland ag fields. There's a whole mix of different crop types. We're looking at rotational, some crop rotations. These darker bands are growing wheat, most likely. These light bands in here are wheat stubble. So wheat that was harvested, it's opened up, which makes it really great for plovers. They love foraging in that kind of open area. But this chick was hatched at this nest on the left. So that this little pin indicates where the nest was located and where the chick came from. And then that picture of it as a 2-year-old was taken not too far away, just 2 years later. So we have very little records of these sort of natal returns right to the same area. Another example, similar. Oh, and I forgot to mention the scale. Yeah, so each of these white squares is what we call a section or a square mile. And again, this is Nebraska. This is so the pin on the left is an adult that was banded. This is where the nest was located. And then in 2013 and 2014, it returned and had a nest half a mile away or so. So we've got a handful of those kind of really interesting returns. And if we know that, this is what's really great about the use of color banding. If we know these areas are important down to this scale, we can better conserve these birds. So I want to share another little fun story about another fun banded bird. So this guy, the 2-week-old on the left, and then the 2-year-old, same bird on the right. We named him Sam. He's got the colors of the flag, red, white, and blue, and he was banded as a chick on July 4th in 2014. And we don't know if he's male or female. I just say he out of habit, I guess. They are not dimorphic, so you have to take blood and do some genetic work to understand if they're male or female. But as I mentioned, so this photo was taken by a birder out of Scotts Bluff named Kathy Delara, and the photo on the left was from a graduate student who banded this bird, Colin Woolley, who works for us at Bird Conservancy now. And then we had a fun little sighting in 2024. So we had a report come through about this banded bird that was photographed by Thane Dinsdale. And I was really intrigued by this, like, who is this bird, and how can we track him down? You can probably see a little bit here, but it's only got, the photo on the right only has a red band and then the metal band. So Thane was driving through and took some amazing photos, but basically, due to his photos, we could zoom in on the USGS unique metal band number. And we saw enough of the numbers to be able to pretty much 95% guarantee that this guy on the right is Sam at 10 years old. So that was super fun. What's also very useful, that USGS unique metal band number, they're mostly used to help identify carcasses, since we know the plastic leg bands can wear off, as what happened to Sam. He lost his blue and white bands. And they help keep track of all researchers with banding permits. This was super fun to track down this guy and trying to do some investigative work, and then realize he was actually our chick from 2014. So keep your photos coming and reports of banded birds. It's super important. I did write a blog about this guy, so I'd be happy to share that link along if anyone wants to read it and see more of Thane's photos. And this is also on the right. This Thane was driving through Kimball, Nebraska. So this guy really likes the area in Nebraska. The habitat you'll see behind him on the right, this is that wheat stubble I was talking about. They call it stubble because it's kind of cut off as if you were shaving your face and there's just a little bit of growth. So this is harvested wheat. Lots of good insects are usually here. There's a photo in the middle. It looks like some growing wheat in there. Right, so switching gears just a little bit, talking about breeding ecology and habitat. They historically have been tied to prairie dog towns long before humans colonized out west. That's where you would find these birds, is moving with bison, prairie dog towns, just encompassing the landscape in great amounts, creating that very little vegetation that they need. They have adapted to fallow croplands or bare as a surrogate, or these harvested areas. And honestly, climate is a major factor in their breeding success in some areas. I mean, these guys really, they like little vegetation. They like drought. It's not ideal for many things, but because it's such a specialized habitat, that is probably a key factor as to why they're so rare. One thing that's really interesting about these birds is they have a uniparental mating strategy. So a female will lay 1 to 3 eggs, 3 at most, in a scrape in the ground. That's about all they create. Usually the male is creating these nests and they're decorating them. And then the female will, how they communicate and the female finds the nest, I'm not really sure. She'll then go put another 1 to 3 eggs in another scrape on the ground, often by a different male. So they really have ways to maximize their productivity. They're very vulnerable by having eggs on the ground like this. But you can see they're well camouflaged. So I think if a predator doesn't find their nests are pretty successful. The chicks are precocial. You'd have to be as a ground nester, so they're up and out within hours. And the eggs are laid asynchronously, so one at a time. So usually that adult is waiting around for that third egg to hatch, and as soon as that chick can even remotely walk, they are gone. So they leave the area and go search for food and cover. So this is a little video. I'm going to see if I can get it to work. We don't need sound. There's just wind in the background. But it shows a defensive display. They'll do that broken wing movement, which you may be familiar with, but maybe not have seen this. So you can see how he's even tilting his head a bit up at the sky, looking, kind of being aware. He or she is trying to draw some attention to himself rather than whatever nest or chicks might be nearby. And this photo actually was taken on the Pawnee, or this video on the Pawnee National Grasslands by an intern several years ago, but it's a fun one. So some of the work that we've been doing must involve private land conservation. Private lands make up nearly 70% of the West, and especially with birds loving farm ground, it presented an opportunity to work with farmers throughout Colorado and western Nebraska. They were proposed for listing in the early and mid 2000s. This listing actually created an opportunity. There was growing concern by farmers, not really understanding what a potential listing could mean. And we enacted a massive outreach effort and endeavor with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Colorado Farm Bureau, so many other partners. I'm not actually sure of all of them in the early 2000s. And basically surveyed and looked for nests on farm grounds throughout the eastern plains of Colorado. We then replicated that effort in Nebraska. And the photo on the top right is Larry Snyder. So he's a farmer that worked for Bird Conservancy. He worked for us for about 15 years. He was our landowner liaison. So he basically recruited every farmer in Kimball County to just grant us a blanket access to look for nests where we could. Many of the farmers were really good at finding nests themselves. They're driving their tractor and they flush a bird, they get out and they find a nest. And then they drive right around it. So he still sends me reports all the time of nests he finds. So he's a great example of some of these community champions in the area. So we marked nests, and I'll kind of walk through that process. But we start by hiring technicians, or we did this for years ago, where we drive side by side on these ATVs, and what we have here is a rope tied between them with a bunch of white flagging. We want to flush the adult off the nest so we can find it. And once we do that, the adult doesn't go too far. They're really not, their main concern is just to get back to their nest. So they're not going to fly off and be gone. Once we flush the adult, we just keep our eye on it till we find the nest. And then we mark the area with these tall, brightly colored orange stakes. And these are pretty tall, a lot taller in reality than they seem here. And these are faced in each of the 4 cardinal directions, so that farmers on their tractors will see the tall stakes and they know, all right, there's a nest in the middle of that, I'll just go around it. And they lose very little production from this. And then what you get is a happy little bird that is pretty eager to just return to its nest and not worry about a thing. It really is not disturbed by this process long term. And so you'll see these patches on the landscape where there is probably a nest in these areas. We don't do this effort anymore. All of this that I'm showing is from western Nebraska. It's incredibly time intensive and expensive. And so we're working more collectively across the species range now at broader scales to think about how to more effectively impact the species. So I'm going to go into some research that we've done, but I do want to acknowledge the many graduate students that have done so much work over the years in various areas and have contributed a piece to the larger puzzle. So over time, we've conducted a number of research projects, really asking questions like, does it even matter to mark nests? Does it actually contribute to the success of the species and aid in population growth? Then looking at chick survival. Once they hatch, we do find a high hatch rate, but once they hatch, are the chicks even surviving? So we've explored that. We've explored habitat use, the use of crop versus range. Why are they using certain types over others? And then we had some questions from wildlife biologists and others at the Pawnee National Grasslands. I'll just touch on this, that the population thrived in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There were many, many dozens of breeding birds at the Pawnee National Grasslands. And the population is pretty much tanked from that area. There are some birds, but they're just not in the same amount. Even with efforts to protect some of the prairie dog towns or create some burn areas for some of that breeding habitat, it isn't the same. And so it's been about almost 10 years now, but we did look at trying to figure out maybe where they're going. We had for years anecdotal information from farmers nearby adjacent to the Pawnee that said, hey, your birds they're on my lands. They're not at the Pawnee. They're all over the place. So we tracked some birds with GPS tags, and we did get confirmation that they're kind of using the Pawnee, but they're going back and forth. They're really using a lot of the adjacent farmland as well. And then trying to understand landowner interest and motivations for participating in conserving a species like this. I just wanted to show this. This is always kind of a fun graphic from one of the studies, but looking at home range for basically where's an adult with a nest utilizing the habitat. So again, this is Western Nebraska. These squares are 1 mile. The red indicates the adult movement, while the nest is still with eggs. Star is the nest. And then in blue is when the nest hatched and the brood moved on. So you could see the adult, she took her babies and they were out of there. So they follow these farm lines, and they're in this what looks like that wheat stubble largely, and they pop in and out of these areas, but they really love these ag fields. It's just kind of a fun thing to share. We've been doing a lot of work with migratory connectivity and really trying to learn, like, where are they going and what is the habitat? What are they using? Are they in areas that really need conservation? So we've done some work across borders as well. And we've got partners in Mexico that we're working with still, and in Colorado to try to take a look at this. So the first, I guess, crack at understanding migratory habitats was in the mid-2000s with geolocator technology. Unfortunately, the spatial accuracy was fairly low, so we couldn't really understand the types of habitats they were using in these areas. But the photos, the graphics in the bottom left are two different individuals, and the blobs in the yellow show migration and kind of these stopover areas. Several years later, we were able to fit plovers with our GPS tags. The tags do have to be, they don't transmit. So in order to get the data, you have to remove the tag from the bird. So you have to catch the bird again. That's also very time intensive, but that did a lot of things for us to start to understand the habitat they're using. We had no idea that they spent so much time, or at least this group, going to Texas. Each of these colors on the right is an individual bird. And then you'll see this massive clump in southeast Colorado, which mirrors what we were seeing with the earlier tags. So we wanted to explore that further. And the data show these populations congregate in this area. Thanks to the higher spatial accuracy, we can see the types of habitat. So zooming in again, this is fall for several weeks, as many as 8 weeks for some birds. They're hanging out over here. And then we can see the habitat that they're using here as well. We wanted to ground truth this and actually do some surveys, because these are tagged birds. I mean, there are only like a handful of birds that are showing us this data. But in 2 years of fall surveys, we detected over about 1,400 individuals or so with a little over 30 flocks. And so we've definitely identified this as a new and important area during fall migration. Looking at winter, we can do something similar, but not only were we surprised to see most of the plovers wintered in Texas compared to California, they also seem to favor croplands. So they're utilizing basically the same habitat, more or less, that they do in the breeding areas. And then this is very similar, but just the use of different technology. So more recently, technology has continued to advance, and we've been lucky enough to deploy Icarus tags. And these run off solar power and remotely transmit the locations via the International Space Station. So no need to catch the bird again. We can collect the data in real time. We can learn exactly and precisely down to the square inch, basically, or at least the square mile, where the types of habitats these birds are using. And then I did want to just mention the work from our partner in Mexico. The graduate student a few years back was tasked to study key areas that have been identified, a lot of them anecdotally, for wintering areas for these birds. And you'll see this map is all of Mexico, or at least northern Mexico. And then also his goal was to confirm if the anecdotal data was true, indicating a potential resident population. And so the blue dots are wintering sites, and the green dots in this red circle, which is his study area, are breeding sites. The habitat is also very similar, pretty much the same for breeding and wintering in Mexico as in the States. And Julio found just what we had expected. The breeding population resides in Mexico year-round. And there's a lot of opportunity for protection for the species. The Mexican prairie dog is a protected species in Mexico. And so that's huge, because they do recognize the need to protect the species. And so there's wintering birds, and there's also birds that live there year-round, which is really exciting. And then some current research efforts going on. Casey Weisberg is a PhD student. She just started last summer, and she'll be working in South Park again to pick up where Allie left off, and then also working in Carville, which is a small town in eastern Colorado, if you're not familiar. But she's going to be looking at spatial and temporal variation of energy availability. Basically, she'll be doing some insect sampling and doing some analysis of food availability and the quality of that food, looking at the timing of their life history events as it relates to their caloric intake, and then chick survival as it relates to some of the biotic and abiotic factors. The goals will be, what are the drivers for chick survival? How is the environment affecting breeding and migration in Carville and beyond? She'll also be putting out some of those migratory tags. And then the goal and outcomes or outputs will be to help landowners and land managers develop informed strategies to better support mountain plover populations. And then finally, many of us have recognized for years that something needs to happen to make a change for this species. Most of us work in our own silos, whether it's like a small breeding site here or there, wintering sites, and we realized we needed to come together. So we formed and codified a working group in the summer of 2024. And I currently am the coordinator. And I've been very fortunate to get some seed money from Fish and Wildlife Service and some others. We've got a large grant from Fish and Wildlife Service pending. I'm not sure about the state of that currently, but we'll see what happens. It's got a lot of energy behind it. We currently have 65 members across every state that this bird occurs in and Mexico. So we're currently working on developing the objectives of the group and then building smaller teams to tackle those objectives to make real change for this species. Once that's codified, that document, then it will become public and we can share it widely. All right. And then to wrap up, I want to share more fun stuff. So years ago, we put some game cameras out, really as an outreach strategy for farmers. Many of them allow us to find and mark nests, but they never really paid attention to it. They were happy to let us do our thing, but we really wanted to, if we couldn't bring them to the birds, when we wanted to bring the birds to them. So you can see this mom, and she's got at least this one baby to her right. I think there's one in front of her. I can't really remember, but she's still incubating somebody, and they're just hanging out. Mom and baby at night. Pretty cute stuff. These are just still photos. I don't have any video. This one was really fun. I was bummed about the dirt clod on the lens here, but this guy he's got, you can see an eggshell in his mouth. So she is taken off with that eggshell to get rid of the evidence. So I could see the little tiny chick in the nest cup in the center, 2 eggs still in the nest. But she's trying to get rid of all any scent of their new family to minimize predation. But that's pretty fun to see that in action. And then many of you probably are aware, but if you're not, the Mountain Plover Festival is coming up in a month. There's a good chance it's already sold out, I've heard. They've had to limit the number of guests due to just space limitations with their bus. They're going to need a second bus, I think. But what's great about this is the ranchers host it in the community of Carbel. They feed people, or at least they have in the past. I know they used to house a lot of folks too. People go down there and camp as well, but it's really a wonderful example of a community just seeing the benefit of having a bird like this on their land and embracing it. And there's true champions down there. So thank you just to all my amazing photographers. And we couldn't have nearly the wonderful photos without you all in the field. And that's just about all I have. Thank you again. Thank you for your support of letting me talk today. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I'll leave you with this fun slide of various different nests. This might be my favorite. This is a nest on the second to the left of a nest in a cow patty. So they like to decorate it in a variety of ways.
Well, thank you very much, Angela, for your wonderful talk. Brought back memories of me of going out to Pawnee grasslands back in the late 70s when they were more common back then, like late 70s, early 80s. So great work and wonderful presentation. Thank you. We do have a question. If a female lays eggs in 2 nests, do you know if both egg nests are successful, and how are both nest eggs incubated?
At the times that we are actively out monitoring nests, then like what Casey's doing up in South Park and in Carbel, she and her technicians are out enough. They are checking nests every day. So they are making sure that they know when the nests hatch. And then there's usually good evidence to show. So if you go and check and there's 3 eggs, and then you go and now there's a chick and 2 eggs, and you do that, and you do it every day once you know it's starting to hatch. The likelihood of them being successful is that nest is completely empty. Signs of predation could be crushed eggshells around. I mean, certainly some creatures could take an egg and you would have no way of knowing, but documenting that, they couldn't have possibly hatched yet, tells me, well, maybe they got eaten because they've only been out for 2 weeks. It takes about 30 days for a nest to hatch, and then another 30 for the chicks to be old enough to fly. And then how both nest eggs, so the adults each do that. So that basically they're done with once she lays her eggs in each of those nests, the male is long gone, but each male, as I mentioned, it might be a different male from a different nest, but each adult incubates its own nest. So a single adult is solely responsible for feeding itself while incubating. Those nest camera pictures that I showed, what was really cool about that is we did take like just collect basic data on time. And I mean, the birds are off their nest a lot of the day, surprisingly. They're on pretty tight at night when predation is high, but they're out and about feeding, and they're not incubating all the time because they can't. They have to feed themselves.
Okay, thank you. How did you gain interest and cooperation from ranchers? I know that's
Mm.
fundamental to a lot of the things that the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies is doing.
Yes, yes. And I work on our stewardship team, so I spend a lot of time thinking about conversations with producers in a variety of ways. And sometimes it's just getting to know folks, not even talking about a resource, just talking about where are you from and the weather, and slowly just building those relationships. Um, I think also sharing some facts about, I'll say, about the proposed listing back in the day. I mean, that's a scary thought to a producer if they're not sure what that means. If to them in their mind they're thinking, "Oh, are you going to take my land away? What if I accidentally run over a nest? What does that even mean?" And so putting their fears aside, and just getting them out there with us in a lot of ways. Just, hey, look at this bird I have in a spotting scope. Come take a look. And then they get really excited. So it's a little bit of just slowly building those conversations. We were very fortunate with Larry in Nebraska, who just happens to be interested and local and a farmer. And so we, just took that opportunity to help talk to others, but it can be a very slow process. Other ways are just basic outreach of mailing flyers or advertising for a workshop, and or just showing that there are ways that we as an organization can potentially help with farming and ranching operations. We found, honestly, these birds were really charismatic enough to garner the attention of a lot of farmers. And they, as I mentioned, a lot of them got really good at finding birds themselves, and they got very excited. And they would call us like, I found a nest, I found a nest. And yeah, so it just seemed to take off from there.
Enthusiasm's infectious, isn't it?
That's a good way
Uh,
to put it.
yeah. And so when you locate a nest and market, the ranchers are pretty keen on avoiding it when in their farming operations.
I think that's also a key to the success and interest that we needed to help generate, was the fact that we were not impeding their farming operations. And this was coming from them. They're like, 6 feet doesn't impact my massive operation. I'll just go around it. It's no big deal. So learning that it wasn't really going to impact them made it quite easy. That combined with the fact that these birds are almost, well, they're tolerant of disturbance. If the disturbance comes and goes, then they're happy, as I showed you, to just sit back on the nest. And so, yes, if the markers were there, and they could see it, then they would happily go around it. And then they could continue to go around it because the patch of vegetation that they left was their new marker if they needed to go back for any reason. So didn't hurt them in any way financially, and that's also very important.
Mm-hmm. Great, wonderful. Do the males get a brood patch?
Oh gosh, Kevin, I see you asked that. Gosh, I should know that. I mean, I would think so. Since both adults have to do that job, I'm gonna guess yes, but I've never really thought about that from a physiological standpoint. I'm gonna look that up to confirm, but my gut says they would need to. It wouldn't be fair to the chicks that got the female, the mom, but I'm guessing they must in order to properly brood those chicks.
As the head of your international working group for mountain plovers.
Mhm.
How are you concentrating your efforts on conservation? What needs to be done to help mountain plovers survive?
Yeah, so we're about 5 months in or so into the working group. Um, we're realizing that we need to figure out what first, what do we think we know and what do we don't know? And we literally had a call today. We meet monthly, where we talked about we need to have just start at the beginning. We need a review of what we know about this species from a research perspective, what we know about it, what it's from a management perspective, and then we need to create sub teams to do the work. One thing that we're starting to do is one of the sub teams will be a monitoring and population survey protocol development. So one thing I was learning pretty quickly last summer is people often share from state wildlife agencies, hey, I got to do a plover survey because it's part of my job, but I don't know anything about them. And do you have a protocol? I don't even know where to begin. And there's a lot of different protocols and a lot of different ways to survey them. Breeding is different than winter. And I mean, that's just one example of like, we just need basic information and we need to do this across state lines and across international lines. Because we're working hard to conserve areas in breeding sites, but we don't know anything about winter sites. And there's changes occurring on landscapes there and a great amount of conversion. But what does that all mean? So we are just starting to scratch the surface, but and as I also mentioned at the beginning, our population estimate is super out of date. I don't trust that figure of 18,000, and I think a lot of people are trying to understand how many birds are we working with here. So we're just starting to collect information, and I think that's a necessary first step.
So when you say 18,000 roughly, maybe fewer, that's the whole species, all the
Yep.
mountain plovers in the world
Yes.
is like 18,000 or less, the whole species.
And I don't think they ever existed in very high numbers. And I forget where I was talking to somebody who had that assumption, but I'm sure they existed in higher numbers at one point. But yes, we think there's 18, maybe 20 at the most. And again, that was a long time ago, almost 20 years ago that we actually did a concerted effort. So I hope we can get a better estimate, which might generate more drive, especially by the powers that be that can assist in changing policy or affect funding to help us to continue the work.
So are there other, evolutionarily speaking, over, eons of time, are there closely related species in this mountain plover might be just the tail end of an evolutionary line of similar
Hmm.
species? Is that maybe what we're seeing?
Hmm. Possibly. I'm not sure I can answer that. I do know, I mean, I think about other species. This is not your question, but other species that occupy similar habitats. And I mean, even just thinking about prairie dog ecology and prairie dog towns and the needs for burrowing owls. And I mean, burrowing owls have even less options than a mountain plover. But there's also other species such as hornlark, which are a little bit more versatile, but we find hornlark nests on crop fields too. So they're making some of those adjustments. And yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for your question, but that's a really good one, though, to follow up with,
Uh,
unfortunately.
okay. Kevin again, can you bring up the migration slide that shows the bird that took the southern route from Colorado to California and returned to the
Sure.
same nesting area by a northern route?
I think you're talking about this guy. Um, so you can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, Kevin. But so this red, this darker red line here. As I mentioned, each color is an individual bird. These all originated in South Park. A GPS tag was put on them. And again, this was the tag that you have to take off the bird to get the data. So this guy in red, he kind of came over here, he came down here, and then he went this way to California, and then came back this way, up again. And the pink is the same bird, actually, just in a different year. So I think that's what you're referring to. This was took a completely different route. I don't know what it's doing over here, but yeah, this was kind of a cool little thing. Yeah, we learn a lot of interesting stuff from these guys moving, and hopefully we can translate that into conservation soon.
And someone's asking about saying a thick-billed longspur in the same niche. What is there a thick-billed longspur?
Yeah, that's another great example of a species that highly specialized, highly dependent on heavy grazing. I'd say definitely, I mean, we have found thick longspur nests in these fallow fields, not too often. But yeah, they are also a species of high concern due to their need to have a very unique habitat. They like a certain type of soil that produces blue grama and buffalo grass. That's a carpet of super short sod, basically, grazed to the bone. And that's not what ranching operations can do in order to stay afloat. So, but I typically think of like a group of species that are similar would be mountain plover, thick-bill longspur, and burrowing owl, and then sometimes hornlark, in terms of what they need.
Okay. The habitat of the eastern croplands and South Park grazing lands are very different. Are they equally successful? South Park versus eastern Colorado.
They are very different. I tend to think they're pretty successful, maybe more successful in South Park. We've got real data from the grad students. I'm not aware of their data just yet, but I know that I think there's some equal amounts of predation. Just in South Park, the risk is more ravens. Up in high elevation, it's at 9,000 feet. It's strange. They don't, but the birds return there. They don't seem to intersperse. So Eastern Plain birds don't tend to go to South Park and vice versa. But the habitat there it's so dry, and it's the land where the students have been. So there's a couple different areas. There's state park land, and then there's also BLM land. Both entities have been really great partners. They graze those areas for mountain plover habitat, and it's just enough. It's perfect conditions. I think due to the arid climate up there, it creates enough patchiness in the landscape to really, if they can avoid the ravens, then they do pretty well up there, I think. But I don't know if they're equally successful. I think the croplands might be a source of a sink if the risk of them there is, I know when we were surveying in Nebraska, predation risk was really low. I mean, there just weren't predators living in the cropland. The main risk would be the tractors. And so without marking nests, they're sort of taking their chances. So it's so hard to say. They might be swapping different ways of being equally unsuccessful.
Is there a breeding population in North Park?
I don't believe so. I'm pretty sure there is not, but I don't know for sure. I don't know that, actually.
Okay. Well, this has been a most interesting talk, Angela. Thank you so much for
my pleasure
for presenting it, and wonderful slides and great illustrations. Thanks so much, and keep up the good work for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. You and your colleagues are doing a great job.